Gunfire in a quiet Rock Hill neighborhood. A 19-year-old standing outside her family home. And a suspect police were already actively searching for. Still on the loose. But here's what makes this case unsettling. The first shots were fired earlier that same night. Officers responded. They searched. They moved through the area trying to track a man identified as Sean Xavier Hubbard, a 34-year-old from Clover, South Carolina. They didn't find him. Then everything went quiet again. For a moment, it felt like the danger had passed. It hadn't, because just hours later, around 11 p.m., the same home was hit again. And this time, Camariya Tidwell never made it back inside. She was struck outside her family residence and died at the scene. Police would later say something that changed how people viewed the entire case. Camariya may not have even been the intended target. So now the question isn't just what happened that night. It's how a situation that reportedly started as a simple dispute over a car repair escalated into repeated gunfire, a police manhunt, and a fatal return to the same house within hours. Welcome to Truth Finder of Fees. In today's case, we break down the killing of Camariya Tidwell. Before we go deeper, take a second to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from right now. Now let's get into it.
Mayfield has the night off tonight. Sean Hubbard is charged with murder after 19-year-old Camariya Tidwell was shot and killed outside the steps of her home on Mount Gallant Road Saturday night. And the family says this is not the first time he's been accused of firing into their home.
Before anything went wrong in Rock Hill, before the police lights and the sirens and the headlines, there was a normal life unfolding quietly behind a front door on Mount Gallant Road. Inside that life was Camariya Tidwell. She was 19 years old. At that age, everything is still ahead of you. Plans that are not fully formed yet. Conversations about the future that still feel flexible. A life that, to everyone around her, was still expanding. Her family describes her as someone who carried herself with calm energy. Not loud. Not disruptive. The kind of person who didn't need attention to be noticed. She was close to her mother, Sean McCullough, and deeply connected to her family circle, including her brother Caleb Tidwell and extended relatives who say she was always present in their daily lives in a steady, grounding way. Photos from before that night show a normal rhythm. Family gatherings, quiet smiles, everyday moments that don't look important until later, when people go back through them and realize how ordinary life really was before it changed. Her mother later described her in simple but powerful words. Bright, harmless, loving, and compassionate. That sentence becomes heavier the more you sit with it, because it describes someone who was not living in conflict with the world around her. And that is what makes what happened later so difficult to process. Because nothing about her life suggested she would become the center of a criminal investigation. And nothing about that night suggests she even understood she was standing inside a situation that had already begun to unravel before she ever stepped into it. Sometime in early May 2026, something small opened the door to something much larger. A vehicle repair arrangement. According to family accounts, Sean Xavier Hubbard, a 34-year-old man from Clover, South Carolina, became connected to the family through work involving a cousin's car. At first, it did not appear unusual. These kinds of arrangements happen every day. Someone needs help. Someone offers skills. Money changes hands. The job gets done. But something changed. At some point, the family says they decided they no longer wanted him working on the vehicle. And that is where things begin to shift. The situation, which started as a simple agreement, reportedly turned into tension. Messages. Disagreements. A growing sense that what should have stayed professional was no longer staying contained. According to those close to the situation, this was the point where things stopped feeling routine and started feeling personal. But at this stage, there is still no clear picture of how quickly things escalated. Only the sense that they did. And sometimes in cases like this, that is the most important warning sign of all. When something small starts to feel unstable, but no one yet realizes how far it might go. By May 12, 2026, that instability reportedly took a more serious turn. The family home on Mount Gallant Road in Rock Hill, South Carolina, was no longer just a place of comfort. It was becoming something else. According to family statements, shots were fired into the residence, not near it, into it. The claim is that bullets entered parts of the home where children were present, including a bedroom belonging to Camariya's brother. In moments like that, everything changes. Sleep becomes harder. Silence feels different. Every sound outside becomes a question you don't want answered. Fear moves into the home and does not leave. After this incident, the family reportedly installed surveillance cameras. Not as an upgrade, not for convenience, but as a response to something they believed had already begun. The idea that someone might return. And what stands out most about this stage of the story is not just the alleged violence itself, but what it represents. A family adjusting their daily life around the possibility of danger, and still not knowing how far that danger might go. At that point, they believed they were reacting to something that had already happened. They did not yet know it was only the beginning. On the evening of May 16, 2026, just after 8:30 p.m., that surveillance system reportedly captured something that would later become central to the investigation. A figure approaching the home. A long object concealed under dark material. A moment of stillness at the entrance. Then movement. And then gunfire. According to reports, shots were fired into the residence through the front area of the home. The sequence was fast, direct. Then it ended just as quickly as it began. And the person responsible left the scene. Family members say no one was inside the home during this specific incident, but the significance was not reduced by that fact. If anything, it intensified what came next, because police were called, and Rock Hill officers arrived shortly after, beginning a search for the person responsible. By 8:31 p.m., units were dispatched. The suspect had already left, and what followed was not resolution. It was uncertainty, because the person they were now actively looking for was still somewhere nearby, and no one could confirm exactly where. Between roughly 8:30 p.m. and 11 p.m., the situation spread across Rock Hill in a way that still did not feel fully contained. Police units moved through the area. Officers checked locations tied to Sean Xavier Hubbard. The York County Sheriff's Office assisted in the search effort. At this point, law enforcement was actively trying to locate a man believed to be armed and connected to the earlier shooting. But he was not found. During this time, the family remained in a state of uncertainty. The home that had already been targeted once that evening was still at the center of everything. Fear does not reset when police arrive and leave. It stays in the background. It waits. Later, Camariya's mother would publicly question how the response unfolded and whether more could have been done in the critical window between the first incident and what came next. Because from her perspective, the danger had not been resolved. It had simply moved out of sight. And the question that begins to form here is the one that will carry through the entire case. If authorities were searching for someone after an initial attack, how did that same situation end with him allegedly returning to the same location again later that night? That answer does not come yet, but the clock is still running. By the time the clock moved closer to 11 p.m. on May 16, 2026, the situation around Mount Gallant Road had already gone through multiple phases. Police had responded earlier. A suspect had been identified. A search had been launched. And yet, nothing about the night had fully stabilized. Inside the home, tension was no longer just emotional. It was physical. The kind of tension that changes how people move, how they speak, how they listen to silence. Family members were preparing to leave or reposition themselves, trying to get away from a situation that had already escalated once that night. And then, according to the investigation and family accounts, movement was detected again around the property. Surveillance reportedly captured activity near the home. Someone was back, carrying a long firearm. What had started earlier in the evening as a shooting incident was now entering its most critical stage. Because this time, there was no assumption of safety. No belief that the worst had already passed. Then the shots came. Outside the residence, the violence erupted again. Rapid, close, final. And in that moment, 19-year-old Camariya Tidwell was struck. She collapsed outside her family home. Emergency responders arrived, but the outcome had already been decided before they reached her. Camariya Tidwell was pronounced dead at the scene. There are moments in cases like this where everything slows down afterward. Not for the people inside it, but for everyone trying to understand it from the outside. Because the question is no longer what happened earlier that night. It becomes why it happened again after everything that had already taken place. And how someone could return to the same location after a police search had already begun. But even in that moment, the full meaning of what happened was still not completely understood. Because the next development would shift the entire direction of the case. Not away from violence, but toward intention. In the aftermath of the shooting, investigators released information that changed how the public began to interpret the case. According to Rock Hill Police, Camariya Tidwell was not believed to be the intended target. That single statement reframed everything, because it introduced a different kind of tragedy. Not just a fatal shooting, but a case where the person who died may not have been the person the violence was directed toward. In situations like this, clarity does not immediately follow. Instead, questions multiply. Who was the target? Why return to the same home? Was this escalation planned? Or was it the result of uncontrolled conflict reaching its breaking point? Family members described a growing sense that the danger had been building long before the final incident. A chain of events that, in their view, had warning signs that were not fully resolved. But law enforcement continues to work through the evidence, including surveillance footage, witness accounts, and the sequence of earlier incidents. And while some details are becoming clearer, others remain under active review. What remains undeniable is the outcome. A young woman who was not part of the original dispute lost her life in the middle of it. And that reality is what continues to sit at the center of this case. Because once you accept that she may not have been the intended target, the entire story stops being just about one confrontation. It becomes about everything that led up to it, and everything that might have changed it. After the chaos of that night in Rock Hill, the focus shifted quickly from what happened to who was responsible. By the early hours of May 17, 2026, law enforcement had intensified the search for Sean Xavier Hubbard. This was no longer a local disturbance response. It had escalated into a full tactical operation. Around 3:30 a.m., officers moved in near the Fig Branch Road area close to Lake Wylie, South Carolina. The atmosphere at that time of night is different. Quiet roads, low visibility, the kind of silence that makes every sound sharper than it should be. Then SWAT units took position, surrounding the area, securing the perimeter, moving with controlled precision as they closed in on a suspect believed to be armed and connected to the fatal shooting hours earlier. Inside that operation, tension was high, but the objective was clear. Locate, contain, arrest. Sean Xavier Hubbard, 34 years old from Clover, South Carolina, was taken into custody during the operation. No extended confrontation was publicly reported during the arrest itself, but the outcome marked a turning point in the case. Because the person police had been searching for through the night was no longer at large. He was now in custody. He was later charged with murder, possession of a weapon during a violent crime, and discharging a firearm into a dwelling. And as the legal process began, one additional detail stood out in the early proceedings. Bond was denied. That decision reflected the seriousness of the allegations and the level of concern surrounding the events of that night. But even with an arrest made, the case itself did not feel resolved. Because arrests close a chapter for law enforcement. But for families, they often open another one entirely. One filled with questions that do not get answered quickly or easily. And that leads directly into what comes next. The aftermath. And the questions that continue to linger around how this situation escalated the way it did in the first place. In the days following the arrest, Rock Hill didn't return to normal. It never really does after a case like this. The police tape comes down, the lights fade, but the silence that follows feels heavier than before. For the family of Camariya Tidwell, the reality was still settling in. A life ended outside her own home. A night that started with fear and ended with irreversible loss. And for the wider community, the focus slowly shifted from immediate shock to something harder to sit with. Understanding. Because once the suspect was in custody, the bigger questions stayed behind. Investigators continued working through the sequence of events tied to Sean Xavier Hubbard and the Mount Gallant Road residents. Earlier incidents, reported gunfire, surveillance footage, and the timeline of police response all became part of a much larger puzzle. But even with pieces coming together, the full picture still didn't feel complete. One of the central questions remained unchanged. How did a situation that began as a reported dispute escalate into multiple incidents of gunfire within hours? Another question followed closely behind it. If there were earlier warnings and an active police response that same night, what changed in the window between the first incident and the final return to the home? For the family, those questions were not abstract. They were personal. They were about timing, about presence, about whether anything could have interrupted the chain of events before it reached its final point. Outside of the investigation, the community reacted in different ways. Some focused on grief, others on accountability, others on the broader fear that situations like this can unfold quietly until they suddenly become irreversible. Candlelight gatherings and memorial moments became a way for people to process something that still felt difficult to fully explain. But even in mourning, one detail continued to shape how the case was discussed. Police statements suggesting Camariya Tidwell was likely not the intended target. That single idea created an even deeper layer of unease, because it meant this wasn't only about one person's actions. It was about how quickly situations can spiral beyond control, pulling in people who were never meant to be part of the conflict at all. And as the investigation continues to develop, the final answers still depend on what emerges in court, what evidence is fully presented, and what details are ultimately confirmed under legal scrutiny. For now, what remains is a case defined by escalation, uncertainty, and timing that changed everything in a matter of hours. Camariya Tidwell was 19 years old. Her name now sits inside an investigation that is still unfolding, with details continuing to be reviewed by authorities and the courts. Some parts of this case are clear. Others are still being built from early reports, witness statements, and ongoing legal processes. But the outcome is not in question. A young woman lost her life outside her family home on a night that began with fear and ended in tragedy. And for those left behind, the timeline is not just a sequence of events. It is something they will revisit for a long time, trying to understand where things could have changed, or whether they ever could have. Because sometimes the most difficult cases are not the ones where nothing is known. They are the ones where too much happens in too little time. If you found this case important, subscribe to Truth Finder Fees for more detailed true crime breakdowns. And tell us where you're watching from. Because in every story like this, there is always one question that stays behind long after the video ends. How did it get this far?
The case may be closed, but the story never forgotten. Thank you for watching Truth Finder.